Alright, welcome to the last video of Unit 10. We are looking at some more post-war U.S. home front after World War II. What was going on in the United States is the question that we are looking at today. Now, the last time we were together, we looked at how people reacted and the creation of the United Nations, really trying to learn from World War One and kind of push for change in the United States. But this is going to be a huge chunk of a connection to today. It's going to be very important for your final. This is going to be the focus of that long response that I'm going to ask you to do. So I really want to pay close attention to an event that starts during World War II and really has a ripple effect into today. During World War II, the fear of the Axis powers is going to bleed into the United States and create a divide between U.S. citizens and immigrants of German, Italian, and Japanese descent. It is going to push for action of the government against these groups of immigrants because we are going to fear that they were trying to infiltrate the United States from the inside and tear down the democracy, and that German, Italian, and Japanese immigrants were here to do no good. But what it really does is single out groups of Americans, because a lot of these people are going to be born in America, and divide the nation. Because of this fear of German, Italian, and Japanese immigrants, we are going to see restrictions of these groups in the form of curfews and camps, internment camps, relocation camps. Now, at first, we are afraid of all three groups, German, Italian, and Japanese. But as the war progresses, Italians and Germans are going to be removed from the enemy aliens list that were subjected to these curfews and contained to camps, because it was too hard to pick out Italian and German immigrants or Italian and German Americans and enforce the curfews and enforce the relocation. But Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants are going to remain, and Japanese Americans are going to be viewed as inherently disloyal after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the West Coast, where we see big populations of Japanese Americans, there are going to be leaders who demand that the threat be dealt with. And FDR is going to take action in the form of Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Executive Order 9062 was a military order that created what was called war zones. And these war zones and this executive order called for anyone to be removed for any reason and relocated. And that reason that they were using to relocate American citizens, because that's what these people were, was that they were associated with people of Japanese descent. And by September of 1942, over 100,000 Japanese Americans are going to be moved to these camps from their homes. And when this removal happened, it was not, okay, come and meet us here by this day, pack up your bags, bring with you what you want, you're going to go on vacation. That's not how this was done. People were told and approached by the military that they need to leave immediately. They could take with them what they could, and they left behind their homes, their businesses, their entire lives, and they were forced into these relocation centers. When we look at why this was able to happen, Japanese Americans lacked political representation, and because they did not have outspoken members in the government to defend their rights, they are going to be easily taken advantage of. They're also relatively isolated from Americans. Their traditions, their language, pushed them away from integrating into mainstream America. Japanese Americans began to move to the war zone or out of the war zones in these interior states. Originally, Japanese Americans are going to be relocated to these war zones. But of course, the people where these war zones were put in more interior states, moving away from the West Coast, they're going to be fearful of having Japanese Americans in the war zones. So there really is no win here. We move Japanese Americans out of their homes into these internment camps, and then when they're in the relocation centers, people are fearful of them there. So the War Department is going to adopt this policy of internment, which says that Japanese Americans have to live in the designated areas and the designated buildings that we say, and they cannot leave, and they will be monitored there for the foreseeable future until we say otherwise. And they call it the temporary internment of Japanese Americans in the camps. Now, these camps, these relocation centers, doesn't matter what you call them, they were old racetracks, they were animal stalls that these people are living in that weren't meant for people to live in. They are going to face food shortages, poor shelters, underfunded schools and medical care in these camps because the resources that are dedicated to the camps are not nearly enough for the number of people that we put in them. I don't know about you, but what I see in those pictures looks more like prison than it does America. And these people committed no crime. The only crime that was being pointed out that put them in these camps was the fact that they were of Japanese descent. Some of them had never even been to Japan. Some didn't speak Japanese. Some may not have even been Japanese. But because they were Asian American, they were believed to be Japanese and pushed into these internment camps, pushed into these places where they had left their entire lives behind. Now, when they left their homes, when they left their businesses, there was no one there running them to keep up with them. Some of them were destroyed because they were known to be run by Japanese Americans. People vandalized them. Their homes, nobody was keeping up with their homes. They were taken out of their jobs. They weren't making money. And they were forcibly relocated. And they're going to be a group of people that didn't fight back. A lot of the people that were forced to move saw fighting back as being unpatriotic. Your government is telling you to move. You do what your government tells you, and hopefully they'll see you as loyal, and this will come to an end quicker. But there will be some that realize that this is unfair treatment. And one of those people is going to be Fred Korematsu. This case, Korematsu versus the United States, is going to ask the question, are the internment camps constitutional? Executive Order 9066 from FDR forcibly removed Japanese Americans, regardless of their citizenships, to these camps. And Fred Korematsu is going to be one of those citizens, an American citizen who was born in America that had never been to Japan, who was just an average 21-year-old. He is going to be forced to move to one of these relocation centers. Now, Fred Korematsu, he is not a fan. He says, I'm not going. He has a girlfriend who he wants to buy a home with. He has a job that he likes. He wants to continue that job. So when the military comes to move his family, he says no. He even goes so far as to meet with a plastic surgeon to change his face and get operated on so he looks less Japanese. He was going to take on a whole new identity and try to change his descent so that he could not have to go to one of these camps. Now, the plastic surgeon only fixes his deviated septum. He does not change his actual look. Fred is going to be arrested. When he's arrested, he tries to say that he is somebody else, and that somebody else that was not Japanese American, but he will be found out and he will be arrested and sentenced to 5 years probation. He is going to appeal his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. What is found in this case is that the Supreme Court agrees with the federal government and says that during times of war, the government has the ability to even force internment because it is for the betterment of society. It is to keep society safe, which means that the federal government can restrict our rights during times of war as long as they have a good enough reason to. We've heard this before. During World War I, in Schenck versus US, the Supreme Court said that the federal government had the ability to restrict our freedom of speech in the name of national security. The same idea is being applied here. Now, when this case comes out, there will be a dissenting opinion, an opinion that goes against the majority. And in that opinion, our guy from the Nuremberg trials, Robert H. Jackson, is going to point out how dangerous this decision is. Because if this decision is made during World War II, what is stopping a future president from doing the same thing but worse? So the Supreme Court, when they made this decision, acknowledged that it is dangerous to say that the government can limit the liberties of the people during wartime. Now, we look back on the internment of Japanese Americans when we study history and realize that it was wrong, the treatment of these people who had nothing to do with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But the government will not accept that they needed to apologize until 1988, when a formal apology is given to the surviving internees, the people who were moved to the internment camps, and payments will be made to those internees. But that's 40 years after the fact. Some of them aren't alive anymore, and some of them don't really want an apology. This history of the treatment of Asian Americans, this is one drop in the bucket of the mistreatment of Asian Americans over time. And we see it today in the current climate that that same group is being subjected to mistreatment and violence because of a greater fear. And this kind of laid the groundwork for it. Many people during World War II said that this was a good decision. Some people, when they look back on history and say this was a good decision, but ultimately it opened a door that we can't quite seem to close, where we say it's okay to mistreat a group of people as long as fear is our excuse, as long as safety, national security is our excuse. Now, all of this is going to be included on your final, so make sure that we revisit this video if needed as you're studying for the final that is to come.